My name is Melody Carter and I'm 26 years old. I'm a doctoral candidate in educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin. But just moments before the most important event of my life, the dissertation defense that marked nearly a decade of relentless study, my father stormed into the room and turned it into a nightmare. While I was presenting the opening portion of my defense over Zoom to the committee, Bruce, the man who raised me with prayer and control, walked in with eyes cold as stone. I sat still, trying to stay calm, hoping he would back away. But he didn't say a word. He yanked the power cord from the wall, dragged me out of my chair like discarded furniture. Before I could react, he threw my dissertation, research notes, scholarship certificates, and letters of recommendation into the fire roaring in the fireplace. My mother, Diane, stood silently, clutching her crucifix, watching my tears fall and whispering, "You need salvation." Have you ever had the most important thing in your life destroyed by your own family, just because they couldn't accept who you are? If you've ever had to fight just to be yourself, leave a comment below. Hit like and subscribe to follow me on this journey, where I tell the truth behind the seemingly peaceful doors of a family home. And what made me not only stand back up, but walk away for good. I returned to the basement after the defense was ruined, still dazed, heart pounding like I'd just escaped a fire. In a way, I had. That basement had been my home for the final year of my PhD program. It wasn't because I couldn't support myself. I was working 3 jobs simultaneously in Madison. But after inflation rose, my scholarship was cut, and my teaching contract wasn't renewed. I was forced to return to Ashbourne, the town I'd sworn I would never step foot in again. My old bedroom had become a storage space for Christmas decorations and old Bibles. My parents said I could stay in the basement, while reflecting on where your life went wrong. The place was damp, cold, with just one tiny window above my head, filtering in light like it wasn't sure I deserved it. I pushed an old wooden table against the wall, borrowed a wobbly-legged chair from the church, fixed it myself and called it my office. There, I wrote my dissertation, on a topic that, if my parents ever found out, they would have burned not just the papers but probably me too. They believed psychology was the work of the devil, that counselors were possessed, that any emotional pain was simply a loss of faith. I lived in 2 parallel worlds that never touched. At home, I bowed my head before meals, cleaned up quietly and said yes sir when my father declared, "A smart woman is a proud woman, and that's dangerous." But at school, I was a sharp teaching assistant, invited to present research at statewide conferences, sought out by peers for guidance on student behavior analysis. I published articles in academic journals, under a pseudonym terrified my family might discover. I learned to hide research papers inside Bible covers, rename my computer files scripture PDFs, and wipe my browser history daily. You might think I'm exaggerating, but let me tell you a small story. One day my mom came into the basement while I was working. I'd forgotten to close my laptop. On the screen was a chart related to post-traumatic stress disorder. She glanced at it and asked, "Are you reading some kind of spiritual nonsense?" I quickly replied, "No, it's statistical software." She nodded, but her eyes narrowed. "I hope you're not drifting like Nathan did." Nathan? My brother. The one they hadn't mentioned in 9 years. He left when he was 17. That night I heard shouting. My father yelling, "You've turned from God. You're no son of mine." The door slammed. By morning Nathan was gone. They told the neighbors he went to a Bible college in another state. But I knew the truth. I found the note he left under my pillow. Just one line. "Melody, if you're reading this, it means you still want to live your truth. Don't let them kill it." I kept that note for nearly a decade, tucked inside a torn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the only book my mother never checked because she considered modern literature garbage of the world. My parents lived in a world of absolutes. You either believed or you didn't. You obeyed or you rebelled. Since I was a girl, they didn't beat me like they did Nathan. But they had other ways. Long silences, disapproving stares, prayers asking God to heal this lost soul. When I came back home out of sheer necessity, my father only said, "You've got 1 month. Then get a real job." None of that fancy research nonsense. I nodded. I always nodded. I was used to being a shadow in my own family. I picked up a morning shift at a local coffee shop a few blocks away. Studied in the evenings. Wrote deep into the night. Some nights, the cold was so bad my fingers went numb typing, but I didn't dare turn on the heater, fearing my father would ask, What on earth are you doing using electricity past 10 p.m.? I'm not sure what hurt more, their disregard or the way I started disregarding myself just to survive. One night, while eating canned noodles quietly in the basement, I heard my father calling down the stairs. Melody, church tomorrow. The new pastor's doing an anointing service for those corrupted by secular education. I called back, I've got work to do. No reply. Just the sound of the basement door slamming shut. Part of me wanted to cry. But the rest, the part that had read every article about depression, family control, and inherited shame, just sighed, reopened my screen, and kept typing. I wrote like every sentence was a rope pulling me out of a hole trying to swallow my life. I don't think anyone can truly understand what it feels like to live in your own home, while hiding who you are. But if you've ever had to fake a smile to survive, ever had to bury your dreams for fear of being cast out, then you already know exactly what I mean. And that's why I kept writing. Because if I let them take even my voice, then I had already lost long ago. I still remember our old house on Willow Street where I spent the first 17 years of my life without ever feeling like I belonged. The walls were painted a dull beige and the couch was always covered in white cloths, like sitting on it was somehow a sin. The only thing hanging on the wall was a wooden sign carved with the words, "The Lord sees all." No TV. No radio. No newspapers. No social media. My father used to say, God gave us ears to hear his word, not the garbage out there. Every night I had to read at least 3 chapters from the Bible and hand copy them entirely. If I got one word wrong, I had to start over. If my eyes got tired, my mom would bring me a cushion to rest my elbows, so I couldn't say I needed a break. She did it gently, like she cared, but it was really to stay in line with her husband's will. By age 8, I knew how to button my shirt up to the collar before going outside, even in the blazing summer heat. My mother would say, "You're a girl. Don't make men sin." When I asked to read books other than the Bible, she just glanced at me and shook her head. "You don't need them. Everything you need is in here," she said, patting the cover of the Old Testament. I learned to read by sneaking peeks at food packaging in the grocery store. I learned how to read maps from a flyer someone left in a shopping cart. Every bit of knowledge I gained beyond what they allowed, I stole in secret. My brother Nathan, he was different from me. He didn't stay quiet. He asked why God would punish a whole city for one man's sin. He asked why mom couldn't stand at the pulpit but had to raise kids, clean the house, cook, and keep silent. One sweltering summer day when Nathan was just 17, our father caught him secretly reading a banned book, Brave New World, borrowed from the school library. I still remember the sound of that leather belt being ripped from his waistband. The smack of it against bare skin. My mother crying outside the door but never stepping in. And Nathan's voice shouting, "I don't believe in this anymore. I don't believe in anyone in this house." That night I stayed up listening to the floor creak above. I peeked through the crack in my door and saw Nathan dragging a suitcase to the front steps. He looked back once. No one said goodbye. No one stopped him. I wanted to run out and hug him. But then I heard Mom say with a tired voice that didn't even sound angry, "A defiant child doesn't deserve to carry our blood." My chest clenched. Not because she said it to him, but because I understood. If I ever stepped outside the family's rules, I'd face the same fate. From that day on, the name, Nathan, didn't exist in our home. They removed his photos from every album. Erased his name from the Christmas card list. And when anyone asked, "How many children do you have?" Mom would answer, "One. Me." I vanished from the inside. I learned how to walk without making a sound. How to nod when spoken to even when I didn't know what was being asked. How to finish schoolwork quickly and tear it up before coming home. I didn't exist as a thinking person, just as a spirit begging to be allowed to stay. I had a tiny space behind the china cabinet, my secret spot, where I hid scraps of paper scribbled with notes I secretly learned from teachers. Concepts about behavioral psychology, critical thinking, defense mechanisms. I read them at night like they were forbidden spells in a banned language. One time I was holding a printed essay on how parental authority shapes a child's self-worth when I heard Mom's footsteps behind me. "What are you doing?" she asked, hand already hovering near her skirt like she was ready to shield her eyes in case she saw something sinful. I turned and forced a smile. Just an ethics assignment. She didn't ask further. But I knew, if Dad ever found out, I'd be banned from school. I once watched a young girl at church be forced to stand for an hour during service because she wore tight jeans. My father leaned toward me and whispered, "See? That's what happens when people stray from modesty." And I wondered, if that were me, who would stand up for me? I thought of Nathan, and suddenly realized I had no one left. Every time I sat in class, I looked out the window. Not to daydream, but to check escape routes. If my parents ever showed up to drag me home, I had to know which way I could run. Have you ever lived in a place called home, but had to plan your escape every single day? I grew up in a cage. Not made of iron, but of belief systems so tightly locked that every door closed before I even realized I was trapped. And I survived by fading myself out, until even I barely recognized who I was anymore. Took me years to believe I had the right to dream. The first dream I dared to hold on to was studying psychology, considered heresy in my house. I remember the way my heart pounded when I selected applied psychology on my college application. My fingers trembled so hard I had to rest both hands on the desk to steady my writing. I knew if my parents found out, they'd make me choose again. Something useful, humble, in service of the Lord. But I chose. And I didn't tell them. When I got to college, I saw the world for what it was. Messy, loud, diverse, but free. I felt like someone who had crawled out of a dark cave, eyes burning from the light, but unwilling to go back. I stayed in the library until late at night just to be surrounded by books that had been forbidden at home. I devoured Freud, Carl Rogers, and Viktor Frankl like a starving person tasting real food after years of being deprived. I did well. Not because I was naturally gifted, but because I had no way back. Every A I earned was a brick in the wall that separated me from the cage of my childhood. In my junior year, I was selected to be a teaching assistant for Professor Eleanor Green, one of the top experts in religious psychology and the effects of extreme belief systems on personal development. When she announced it in class, I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Melody Carter," she said, locking eyes with me, "I read your essay on defense mechanisms in closed religious environments. It's far beyond what I expect at your age. Would you consider assisting me next term?" I nodded, throat tight like I had just swallowed fire. "Thank you, it's a real honor," I managed to say, voice shaking. "No need to thank me," she smiled. "You earned it." It was the first time someone told me I was worthy. Not for being obedient. Not for being silent. But for thinking, writing, and understanding. I never told Professor Green about my family. I was afraid if anyone knew, they'd see me as a victim. And I was so tired of being defined by other people. I played the role of a regular student. Attended seminars. Led study groups. Gave campus tours to freshmen. Everyone assumed I came from an academic family. I let them believe it. There was something safe about living as two versions of myself. Both me, but never fully. Until that seminar. The topic was religious freedom and the boundaries of influence in child education. It was held in a large conference room packed with students, faculty, and even outside guests. Professor Green was moderating, and during the open discussion she asked, "Does anyone want to share a personal experience related to today's topic?" I felt my hand rise before I knew why. She nodded, signaling for me to take the mic. I stood up without saying my name. I simply said, "I want to tell you about a child who was taught to believe, not given the choice to believe." I spoke in a calm tone, like narrating someone else's story. But every word came from my own memories, about a little girl who wasn't allowed to ask why, only taught to say yes. That little girl, I said, grew up in a home where books were censored, thoughts were suffocated, and love was conditional on submission. She didn't get to choose her path. She only learned to follow one and pretend she liked it. The room went completely still. No laughter. No nods. Just held breaths. I glanced around and saw eyes beginning to well up. Some people looked down. One or two wiped their faces. An older man, maybe a visiting professor, shook his head slowly as if holding something back. But one woman stood up. Middle-aged, wearing a long navy skirt, curly hair, a large cross necklace. She picked up her bag, turned, and walked out of the hall without a word. I watched her go. Not out of fear or anger, but because I was used to people leaving when they didn't want to listen. After that day, I didn't talk much about it. But Professor Green came to me as I was gathering my books. "Thank you for your courage," she said gently. "I'm not sure it helped anyone." "It helped me," she replied. And probably many others. Sometimes one person speaking up is all it takes for those who've been silent to feel less alone. I let out a soft laugh. I didn't say anything more. That night, back in my room, I opened my laptop. I wrote the first line of my doctoral thesis, the one I had always feared would get me burned at the stake like a medieval heretic. Freedom of belief cannot exist without the freedom to choose that belief. I had no idea where my story would lead. But I knew I had taken another step out of the shadow of my past. And once you step into the light, you never really want to go back. The message came in around 2 in the morning. I was curled up in the basement, my mind spinning with notes, readings, lab shifts, and the upcoming deadline for Chapter 3 of my dissertation. I couldn't even remember when I had drifted off. The laptop was still dimly glowing beside me, and from above, I could hear the whistling wind slipping through the cracks near the furnace vent. My phone vibrated gently under the pillow. I reached out, still half asleep, and squinted at the screen. It was an unknown number not saved in my contacts. The message was just one line. You're betraying your family. Stop or face the consequences. Right below it was an image. I tapped on it. It was a screenshot of me speaking at the recent seminar, the exact moment when I talked about the child forced to believe. The image was blurry, but it was undeniably me. My voice echoed in my head like a whisper from the bottom of a well. She wasn't allowed to choose her path. She only learned how to pretend she liked it. I shot upright, heart pounding. A chill ran down my spine. Who sent this? Who recorded the screen? That seminar was only open to students and faculty. No live stream, no public access. A few names flickered through my mind, but none of them had any reason to threaten me. I checked the number carefully. The area code was one I recognized. Ashbourne. I texted back, "Who is this?" No reply. I got up and wandered around the basement like a sleepwalker. My chest felt tight, like an invisible cord had wrapped around me, pulling tighter and tighter. I turned on the computer, logged into my university account. Checked emails, Google Drive, every place I could think of. Nothing seemed off. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I went to Professor Green's office earlier than our scheduled meeting. She was just pouring tea when I walked in, silent, like she'd already sensed something was wrong. "I know that look," she said without me saying a word. "What happened?" I placed my phone on her desk and showed her the message. She picked it up, squinting to read each word carefully. "This isn't a prank," she said slowly. "Do you suspect anyone?" "I think it might be someone from my family," I said, my throat dry. "No one else would call me a traitor." "Does anyone in your family know what you're studying?" "Not exactly. I told them I was majoring in school behavior and social studies, to stay safe. But if they saw your talk at the seminar, they could piece it together." I nodded. Professor Green sighed and set her teacup down. "You know, some extremist religious groups monitor their children's activities in academic spaces. They see universities as places where their kids are corrupted. In certain cases, families even hire people to spy on them or send someone into private events." I frowned. "You mean someone might have been at the seminar, recorded it, then sent it to them? Or someone was already in the room but didn't have your back?" I didn't respond. The image of the woman who had walked out during my talk flashed in my mind. That navy skirt. The large cross necklace. "Do you remember the woman who left midway through your talk?" she asked, reading my thoughts. I didn't get a good look at her face. But I remember her cross. It looked exactly like the one my mother wears to church. Is it possible she was sent by someone? I didn't know how to answer. Everything in my mind felt tangled. "For now, you shouldn't go home alone," she said gently. "I can connect you with the student support group. We have advisors trained in security in cases like this." "Do you really think I'm in danger?" "Melody," she said firmly. "People don't send messages like that for fun. And when religion becomes extreme, you can't afford to be careless." I stayed quiet for a long time. In my mind, I heard my father shouting, "Dangerous thinking leads to lost souls." I remembered my mother's gaze, gentle but cold. "You can learn all you want, sweetie, but don't let it take you away from God." I had never thought they could. But then I remembered Nathan. Remembered the beating. The night he left without a word. And I understood. Nothing was off limits if they believed they were correcting a lost soul. I left Professor Green's office with a slip of paper containing contact info for the Student Support Center, but my mind was still spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Who sent the message? Who took the video? And why? Why, after years of silence, did one moment of speaking up make everything fall apart? There was one thing I did know. Someone was watching me. And that person knew my past better than any of my classmates. 3 days after the threatening message, I received an email with a subject line that made me jump up in the middle of the library. Melody, it's me, Nathan. My hands trembled as I opened it. Not out of fear, but because it felt impossible. For 9 years, I hadn't known where Nathan was or even if he was alive. No trace, no messages. Deep down, I'd always feared our parents had done something to him, and buried it beneath that familiar shell of religious righteousness. His email was short, but every sentence felt like it pierced through the walls I had built around my emotions for so long. Melody, it's Nathan. I don't even know how to start this. But I saw your seminar clip. Someone from town shared it in a private group. Believe me, you're about to face something serious. The cost of stepping into the light isn't freedom. 4. I'm living in Oregon now. I work with people who've been cast out by their families just for asking questions. If you need me, don't wait. I know what's going on better than you think. At the bottom, he included a phone number, a backup email address, and one final note that made my chest tighten. Be careful around Mom and Dad. Don't assume they've changed. I sat frozen for a long time, eyes glued to the screen as if blinking might make him disappear again. Then I tapped call. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. A deep voice, still familiar. Melody. I bit my lip and nodded, knowing he couldn't see me. It's me. He was quiet for a moment. Then whispered, it's been 9 years. I couldn't hold back my tears. I thought, you were dead. I just disappeared from their world, Nathan said. Because if I stayed, I would have died. Or lived like I was already gone. We stayed silent for a long time. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from not knowing what to say, but from having far too much to say. Finally, I told him about the text message, the video that had been recorded, the feeling that someone was watching me. Nathan sighed. They've started already. Who? I asked. Your parents, he answered. And the people with them. That community has chains you can't even imagine. Back when I left, they filed a petition in state court to have me declared legally incompetent. I was stunned. You're serious? They said I was influenced by a cult, disoriented, mentally unstable because I rejected the faith. They submitted forged medical records and their pastor testified against me. I was almost confined to a care facility for a disorder that didn't even exist. My heart clenched. Why would they do that? Because I dared to leave the mold they built. And now you're doing the same. I stood still. Melody, Nathan continued, I once thought if I disappeared they'd stop. But no, they don't care whether I live or die. They only care about protecting the image. The more successful you are, the more ashamed they feel. The more truth you speak, the more they want to silence you. Softly I said, but they're our parents, Nathan. No, Mel. His voice hardened. They're adults who chose to believe that controlling their children was part of faith. That's not love. That's possession. I suddenly remembered the look in my father's eyes at church. Not the gaze of someone who loved, but the stare of a warden. Nathan went on to explain that he was now working for a nonprofit that helped people cast out by their families for religious differences. He had once helped a woman forced into rehab because she refused to attend prayer groups. A young man who was cut off financially because he wanted to major in sociology. You're not alone, Nathan said, his tone softening. I'm not that 17-year-old boy with nowhere to go anymore. If they threaten you, I'll stand in front. I leaned back in my chair, feeling my chest lighten just a little. For years, I hadn't allowed myself to believe anyone would truly stand with me. Do you regret it? I asked. Leaving? No, he said. The only thing I regret is not taking you with me. I went quiet, eyes stinging. Mel, he said gently, there will come a day when you'll have to choose. Stay silent for peace or speak and pay the price. I can't choose for you. But I can be there when you do. We talked for nearly an hour more. When the call ended, I didn't feel at peace. But I felt clearer than ever. I was no longer the child locked in a shed of my youth. And if I was about to step into a storm, at least this time I wasn't alone. I finished the final chapter of my dissertation on a drizzly evening. The basement was still the only space I could call mine, even if only temporarily. Damp plaster walls, dim yellow light, the stale smell of old air. But in my hands was a manuscript nearly 200 pages long, the sum of 8 years of study, work, endurance, and writing. Title: Education as a Means of Psychological Liberation in Oppressive Religious Environments. I stared at that line on the cover, my heart pounding as if I had just confessed something no one in my family ever wanted to hear. It had taken me nearly a year to dare write the title I truly meant. My early drafts still avoided it, calling family models like mine closed environments, traditional households, conservative communities. But the deeper I researched, the more I interviewed, analyzed, and compared theories, the more I realized there was nothing wrong with naming the truth plainly. Oppression is oppression. I sent the manuscript to Professor Green at 2 a.m. with a short message: I've finished writing. I won't edit my words to ease anyone's conscience anymore. The next morning she replied with just one word: brave. The review board agreed to hold my defense online since I was out of town. I told myself it was reasonable, pandemic, distance, saving time. But the truth was I couldn't leave home. Partly because of finances. I was still working part-time at a local coffee shop, saving every dollar for postdoctoral applications. The rest was something I didn't want to admit. I hadn't let go of the fragile hope that my parents might acknowledge me. Something inside me, though I knew it was irrational, still longed for the day they would look at me without suspicion or scorn. I pictured my mother sitting behind me during my defense, her hand on my shoulder, eyes misty. I'd seen that moment in films, heard friends describe their own fathers hugging them afterward, saying, "You did it." I wondered if my father had ever thought those words. Even once. The morning before my defense, I brewed tea and brought it upstairs. My father was at the table reading his thick Bible, glasses slipping down his nose. I set the cup in front of him. "Tomorrow I have my dissertation defense," I said quietly. He didn't look up. "What is that?" "It's the final step to complete my doctorate." He nodded slowly, then exhaled. "Doctorate. Sounds like someone thinking they're better than others." I clenched my hands behind my back. "It's not about being better. It's about doing the work I want." He lifted his head and looked directly at me. His eyes weren't angry. They were cold. Cold enough to make me shiver. "What kind of work makes you write about your own home as if it were a prison?" I froze. "You think we don't know?" he pressed. "You think that video didn't reach us? You sat before strangers, talked about a girl forced to believe in God, and pretended that wasn't you." I said nothing. "You're smearing this family. Smearing faith." My mother stepped out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth, watching me silently. I swallowed hard. "I'm not smearing anyone. I'm just telling my own story." "That story is how you choose to see it," my mother spoke. "You could choose gratitude. But you choose anger." I turned away, walked down to the basement, my heart pounding like it had been kicked. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong. But because my tears had long since dried, leaving only a shell of hardened silence. That night I reworked my slides. Notes, charts, citations. I set the alarm for 6 a.m. Even though the defense was at 9, I knew there was no room for delay. I printed a copy. Folded it neatly and placed it in my bag. Just in case something happened again. I had lived my whole life avoiding conflict with my parents. But I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. And that line, between two worlds, was waiting for me to cross. I looked at the printed thesis. There was no doubt anymore. I had written what they never wanted to hear. But I couldn't not write it. I couldn't not live honestly. Tomorrow, no matter what happened, I would speak my truth. And if necessary, I would speak with the scars in my soul. I couldn't sleep. All night I kept staring at the basement ceiling, where the faint light from the small window reflected the blurred shadow of the fireplace above. I had prepared everything. The laptop fully charged, the backup hard drive beside it, the scholarship certificate, the recommendation letter, the printed thesis with my advisor's signature. All neatly arranged on the desk like the last traces of a journey no one had witnessed but me. I stayed awake until 3 a.m., then finally drifted off on the chair with a thin blanket draped over my shoulders. I didn't dream. There was only an emptiness between two worlds, between a daughter about to step into the light, and a child still locked in the darkness of a house filled with doctrine and control. Around 6 a.m., I jolted awake at the sound of the basement door being forced open. My father's footsteps echoed down the stairs, heavy and strangely urgent. "Melody." I sat up straight, my heart pounding fast. "What are you doing down here?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer. His eyes swept the small room, stopping at the stack of papers I hadn't had time to put away. I rushed forward, covering the desk instinctively. But it was too late. He grabbed the printed thesis, flipped through a few pages, then stopped at the title. "Education as a Means of Psychological Liberation in Oppressive Religious Environments." "Liberation?" he repeated, eyes fixed on me. "Psychological?" I already explained. This is a research project, not. "Betrayal," he cut me off. "This is betrayal." I took a step back. "You don't have the right to destroy my work," I said slowly. "The defense begins at 9. I need space." He squinted, looking at me as if I had just uttered something blasphemous. "Since when did you think you had the right to demand anything in this house?" I clenched my fists but said nothing more. He didn't act further. He just carried the printed thesis and silently left the basement. I stood frozen for a long time, full of doubt. Part of me wanted to believe he was only angry and needed time. But another part, the part one had learned to listen to over the years, told me this wasn't over. I opened the laptop, checked the Zoom connection. Everything was fine. I logged in early, opened the PowerPoint, tested the camera. 8:45. I went upstairs, needing a glass of water, my mind tight as a wire. The kitchen air was heavy as lead. My mother sat reading the Bible, fingers running through her rosary beads. My father stood by the fireplace, clutching his old Zippo lighter. I saw the stack of papers on the table. The printed thesis, partially crumpled. "Dad," I said, "give me back my materials. The defense is about to begin." He didn't turn around. I stepped closer. "I'm not joking." "Correct," he said in a low voice. "This is not a joke. This is about the soul." Then, before I could understand, he threw the thesis straight into the fireplace. I screamed. I lunged forward. But the fire had already caught. I turned to grab the laptop, but before I could move, he seized my arm. "You are not allowed to lie anymore. You cannot use knowledge against God. Let me go." I pulled hard, breaking free, and ran downstairs. But before I could sit, he stormed in, yanked the plug, ripped out the internet cable, then pulled the laptop from my hands. "Stop. That's all my work," I screamed. But he didn't stop. He dragged all the documents, the hard drive, the laptop into the living room, throwing them onto the rug near the fireplace. I chased after him, but he had already lit the fire. The flames erupted as if it was what he had long awaited. My mother sat in a corner, eyes closed, beads slipping through her fingers, whispering without pause, "Lord, please save this soul." I stood in the smoke-filled room, watching every word I had written vanish in the fire. It wasn't just paper. It was the years I had survived, the dreams I had carried, and the voice I had just learned to raise. "You are no longer my daughter," my father said, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. "You have chosen the world. And you will bear the consequences." I had no tears left. I walked out the door, dizzy, my heart racing. But in that haze, I knew I had just witnessed something that could never be undone. Something had died. Not the thesis, but the last bond between me and what was once called home. I ran out of the house like a sleepwalker. Barefoot, my heart pounding as if trying to break free from my chest. The cold wind lashed my face, each gust stabbing my ribs. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape as far as possible from my father's eyes and voice, from my mother's silent fingers running through the beads while my life was burning before her. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, my hand trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed Professor Green first. I need help. My father destroyed everything." She didn't ask anything more. She only said quickly, "Melody, where are you? Leave the house right now. Call someone you trust. I'll alert the university tech team to keep the Zoom gate open." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I sent a message to Nathan. He burned everything. Seconds later, the screen lit up. "I'm getting in the car. Don't go back to the house. Wait for me." I ran across the yard to the house at the end of the small road. the one with the faded American flag and the wooden eagle statue on the porch. I knocked, almost pounding. Henry opened the door, his wrinkled face appearing behind the screen. He was the only neighbor who had ever spoken up when he heard my mother crying after being beaten by my father a few years ago. A former Marine, he now lived with his divorced daughter and granddaughter. Melody? Oh God, what happened to you? My dad, he burned my entire dissertation. My defense is coming up, but it's all gone, all of it. He didn't ask any more questions. He swung the door wide open. Come in. You're shaking too much. I nearly collapsed onto the floor. He brought me a blanket, his hands trembling with anger. My daughter just went to the store, the computer's still on. Do you need it? I nodded. His granddaughter, a girl about 12, looked at me with wide eyes before quickly turning away. I stepped into the small room where a laptop sat silently on the desk, the glow of the screen reflecting off pink stickers covering its case. I sat down, typed in the Zoom password I had memorized, and connected. The window appeared. The defense committee was still waiting. One professor asked immediately, Melody? Are you all right? We've been waiting almost 10 minutes. I took a deep breath, swallowed my tears, and adjusted the camera. My voice came out hoarse. I'm sorry. There was a technical issue. I'm ready now. No one asked further. I began. No slides. No printed draft. Just my voice. Every word I spoke was like a fragment salvaged from memory, lines I had memorized through countless sleepless nights. I spoke about doctrine and psychological trauma, about how children raised in extreme environments could grow up without ever understanding the meaning of choice. My voice trembled, but my eyes never looked down. When I finished, there was a long silence. One professor finally spoke. I don't usually say this, but your defense was one of the strongest without materials that I have ever seen. Professor Green was right. This isn't just research. This is a cry for help. I stayed silent. Another professor added, Melody, you can submit the documents again later. But the dissertation itself is clearly complete. We are in agreement. You are officially a doctor. My vision blurred. I nodded, then asked to end the call. I sat staring at the black screen, my mind hollow. Henry entered with a glass of warm water. You all right? I didn't answer. Just stared at my hand gripping the glass. You can stay here as long as you need, he said softly. Back then your dad tried to sue me for calling the police. But I don't regret it. And I sure don't now. I nodded. My daughter just came back, he added. She'll cook something for you. I stayed still. On my phone, a message appeared from Nathan. I'll be there in 4 hours. Don't leave that place. I looked at the sunlight streaming through the window, so gentle it felt unreal. Maybe that was the first morning I had ever seen begin, without having to ask permission from anyone. I sat there, staring at the blackened screen, still unable to fully grasp what had just happened. I had finished my defense. I had earned my doctorate. No printed pages, no slides, no family witness, but never had anything felt more rightfully mine. My head still throbbed, the swelling on my forehead pulsing with pain as I changed the bandage. But I had no time to rest. I knew if I didn't act now, I would forever live under the shadow of silence and invisibility I had endured all those years. That same night, after the committee confirmed the result by official email, I went with Mr. Henry and his daughter to the local police station. In my hand was a copy of the report Professor Green had helped me draft, detailing academic sabotage, domestic abuse, and intentional obstruction of education. The desk officer, a woman in her 40s named Claire, greeted us with skepticism at first. But when I showed her the security camera footage from the neighbor's house, my father dragging me out of my room, flames roaring in the fireplace with my laptop and papers inside, her expression changed completely. We'll file an urgent report. Do you need an emergency protective order? I nodded. Yes. He used to beat my mother. I'm afraid he'll come back. Claire filled out the form. Every line of printed text felt like cement poured over the broken foundation my parents had once called family. The next morning, the temporary protective order was approved. My father, Bruce, was banned from coming within 300 feet of me, whether at church or school. I also asked the university lawyer to file a formal court complaint against him for obstructing my academic process. The news spread quickly. A professor from the defense committee wrote a short piece in the field's internal journal. We often think of academic obstruction as politics or plagiarism. But sometimes, it begins right in the living room, the place that should have been the safest. 2 days later, Professor Green called me. Melody, I have good news. The Institute for Psychological Education Research in Santa Barbara is opening a postdoctoral fellowship. They read the article. They want to meet you. I froze. You mean? It means if you agree next month you could fly to California. Out there, no basements. No fireplaces. Just light and air. I laughed, a dry sound scraping from a chest cage too long. I don't know if I deserve it. Melody, she interrupted, her voice softening like a real mother's. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You survived. That day I sat alone in the small room at Mr. Henry's house, watching sunlight filter through the trees outside. In my hands was the official certificate confirming my doctorate, and the email invitation for an interview at the Santa Barbara Institute. I still hadn't opened that email. Partly out of fear. Partly because a small part of me still hoped my mother would call. But nothing came from her. No call. No message. Only an old letter I found tucked in the pocket of my coat, written years ago and slipped there during one of my rare visits home. Whoever walks away from the light of God will forever live in darkness. I stared at those words, then folded the paper and dropped it into the trash. Darkness, to me, has never been something that comes from the outside. It lives in silence, in prejudice, in the unaccepting gaze of the one who gave you life. But if I had to choose again, I would rather walk into an unknown future than live forever in a house where trust meant fear. I opened my laptop and began answering an email from Santa Barbara. The first line I typed was, "Thank you for believing in me." The conference hall blazed with light. The wall behind me was covered with LED screens displaying the title of my presentation, "Breaking Invisible Chains, Rebuilding from Where They Wanted Us to Disappear." I stood there, surrounded by applause echoing through the hall, yet inside I felt as still as a lake after a storm. In front of me were more than 300 faces. Scholars, experts, students, and even survivors of hells that looked like mine. In the front row, Nathan sat quietly, his eyes shining with open pride. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry. But when I saw that look, my throat tightened. I stepped up to the wooden podium, my hand resting lightly on the microphone. One deep breath. A moment of silence. Good evening, everyone. My name is Melody Carter. I noticed a few eyes lift with attention, perhaps at the sound of that name. A name once buried in silence. A name I avoided writing on forms. A name that had dragged me out of rooms, burned away my most precious things, and cut me off from blood ties. But today that name stood in the middle of the stage. Bold on the conference program. On every slide behind me were the words, "Dear Melody Carter, researcher, speaker, and survivor." I began not with data but with a memory. When I was 12 years old, I once wrote a small essay about freedom of thought in an evening Bible class. I never turned it in. I hid it inside an old book tucked beneath my mattress. My father found it. He tore it in front of me and said, "Your mind doesn't need freedom. It needs salvation." A few sighs rippled through the hall. An older woman pulled out a tissue. I went on. I don't share this to place blame. I share it so we understand. Many of us grew up in spaces where free thought wasn't seen as normal but as dangerous. And the psychological aftermath of that, depression, anxiety disorders, dissociation, doesn't come from the outside. It comes from suffocating yourself just to survive under your own roof. I presented my findings. About the percentage of adults who had grown up bound by extreme religious control and carried into adulthood a silent but deep wound. About how the education system can become a place of healing. If it listens, if it refrains from judgment, if it empowers learners to tell their stories in their own language. Not everyone gets the chance to start over. I paused, staring into the livestream camera. So if I stand here today, I want to use the name Melody Carter to speak for those who still cannot. I don't recall exactly how long I spoke. I just remember that when I finished, the entire hall stood in ovation, and the applause didn't stop even after I left the podium. I stepped down and Nathan came to hold me tight. "You did it," he whispered, his hand firm on my shoulder. "And this time no one can take it away." I smiled as tears slid down my cheeks. melting at last after years of being frozen. A middle-aged woman approached me from the crowd, wearing a soft floral blouse, her eyes wet. "Thank you," she said hoarsely. "I'm the mother of a gay son who was cast out of our home for faith's sake. What you said today, it helped me understand him better." I squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for listening." After the conference, I sat alone on a long bench outside, beneath the golden afternoon sun. In my hand was the speaker badge I still hadn't removed. I traced the bold letters, "Dear Melody Carter," and thought back to every step I had walked. The cold basement, the blazing fireplace, the borrowed computer in a neighbor's house for my defense, the sleepless nights of panic, the questions with no answers. Now, I no longer needed apologies from my family. I didn't need their acknowledgement or admission of fault. What I needed, I had claimed. A life with a voice, a community with heart, and a name I could speak aloud in the light, without fear of who might hear it. Have you ever found yourself living two lives? One just to survive and one to truly be yourself? Have you ever kept silent for too long, afraid of losing loved ones, even when they were the ones hurting you most? I know everyone hearing this story will carry their own emotions. Maybe you were once a Melody. Maybe you're a mother wrestling with guilt for not understanding the child you tried to force into a mold. Maybe you're the neighbor who silently witnessed and wondered whether you should intervene. Whoever you are, please share your thoughts in the comments. Because when we dare to speak, we are no longer alone. If you believe every person deserves the chance to define their own life, if you have sought or are still seeking a way out of invisible chains like the ones I once bore, stay with this channel. There will be more stories. About family, about choices, about those who seemed broken but rose brighter than ever. Hit subscribe so you don't miss these real slices of life, these deep lessons and these courageous, inspiring journeys. Because sometimes all it takes is the right story at the right time to open a door for someone lost in the dark.